This weekend, Alabama quarterback Tua Tagovailoa suffered a really terrible hip injury, dislocating his right hip as well as suffering a fracture to one of the bones in his hip. Understandably, people are making a lot of comparisons back to what happened with Bo Jackson, and this certainly could be a career-threatening injury for Tua. Welcome back, everybody, to your #1 source for learning about everything related to sports injuries and sports medicine news. In today's video, we're going to take a look at hip dislocations, specifically talking about it in relation to Alabama quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. What we'll do is take a look at the mechanism of how this happened during the play, review the relevant anatomy, and just some basic information about hip dislocations, and then we'll talk about kind of the connections here between what happened with Bo Jackson and try to look at the similarities and differences. A lot of stuff's been floating around out there online about what impact this could have on his career, that it could be career ending, and so on. So stick around for this video because we're going to try to tease through some of this information. Make sure and go subscribe if you guys like this type of content and want to stay up to date with my future videos, and let's get started. Right off the bat here, there's been a lot of talk about whether or not his previous ankle injury had anything to do with this hip dislocation. While you might be able to debate whether or not his mobility was affected by his ankle injury and that's why he got tackled, I don't think that the ankle injury itself had anything to do with the fact that he had the hip dislocation. Let's go next to the play of when this happened and keep in mind that it was his right hip that was dislocated. As Tua is being tackled to the ground here, we can see that his right knee makes impact with the ground while his hip is in a flexed position, meaning his knee is up a little bit towards his chest. That impact of the knee pushing into the ground causes a posterior directed force to be applied through the hip joint, which causes the fracture and causes the posterior hip dislocation. The hip joint is essentially a ball and socket joint. The ball is the head of the femur and the socket is called the acetabulum and it's part of the hip bones. The hip joint is a very deep socket. It usually takes a lot of high impact force such as a car accident to actually suffer a dislocation. A true hip dislocation occurs whenever the head of the femur is completely outside of the socket. In the case of Tua, it was a posterior dislocation because the head of the femur ended up behind or posterior to the socket. In the case of Bo Jackson, it was much more likely a hip subluxation, meaning that the ball of the femur partially came out of the socket, but was still sort of sitting within the component. If Bo Jackson had had a complete hip dislocation, there would have been no way he would have been able to relocate it himself on the field. But as we saw here with Tua, he couldn't put any weight at all on his leg. And that is really because of the fact that it was a true complete dislocation where the socket and the ball are completely disconnected. The other injury Tua sustained here was what we call a posterior wall fracture. The wall is the acetabulum, and so the posterior wall implies the back portion of the acetabulum that was fractured. What probably happened here was the force generated whenever his knee made contact with the ground caused the ball of the femur to get pushed backwards into the socket, and it pushed with enough force that it broke through the socket, dislocated, and left the fracture behind. The addition of the posterior wall fracture is a lot of what makes this, for certain, a much longer recovery period. These types of fractures often require fairly comprehensive surgery to repair that can result in a prolonged absence in and of themselves. It is possible for the hip to become dislocated with no fracture, where then once you relocate it, you don't have as long as a recovery period like Tua will have because of the concomitant fracture he also sustained. If you were following some of this news on Twitter, you probably heard about this idea of something called AVN, or avascular necrosis, being one of the major long-term risks after this injury, because of course that's what we heard about with Bo Jackson. Avascular necrosis is death of the bone and the cartilage because of having poor blood flow to those tissues. We see avascular necrosis much more often in non-hip dislocation situations, but whenever you have a hip dislocation, you can have tearing of the blood vessels that supply blood to the hip joint that can then result in this impaired blood flow and lead to the development of AVN. Looking at the blood flow around the hip here, you can see all these tiny little arteries and blood vessels that are working to supply blood to the bone, to the cartilage, and to these tissues within the hip joint. Depending on the severity of the dislocation, these blood vessels can become disrupted and become compromised, leading to an increased risk of AVN. Tua was taken by helicopter to the nearest hospital, and we found out after the game that they actually were able to reduce his hip right there at the stadium, and this is extremely, extremely important and could potentially save his career and his quality of life because of how quickly they acted. Your risk of avascular necrosis increases if it takes longer to reduce the hip and get it back in place. By some estimates, if you're able to reduce the hip in under 6 hours, your risk of AVN can be less than 10%. Compared to if it takes longer than 6 hours, that risk substantially increases. Time is tissue, and so as soon as they can get that hip reduced and back in place, the better his outcomes are going to be down the road. So this is a very good sign for him that they were able to reduce the hip right then and there as soon as it had happened and he got off the field. Another thing to remember with AVN is that it typically takes a very long time to develop. It's usually not something that happens right away. This is something that can take years in some instances to truly manifest itself. And so it's possible we won't see the full effects of this until further down the road. Certainly if they see features of his injury that raise higher suspicion for AVN, like a prolonged time to reduce the hip joint, or a more severe injury with other fractures, with ligament damage, they're going to have a higher index of suspicion to look for avascular necrosis and manage it sooner. But sometimes it takes a long time for this process to actually develop. Let's finish up here by comparing this to what happened with Bo Jackson. If you remember the story of Bo Jackson, there was a play in which he was running, he seemed to kind of step awkwardly, and at the time said that he had dislocated his hip and then popped it back in place. But more likely what happened was he had a hip subluxation, with the resultant fracture of, I think, the acetabular rim is what they said. Basically, this means the hip partially dislocated, or the ball of the femur came a little bit out of the socket, but still stayed on that rim of the hip socket. Part of the challenge with Bo Jackson was back 30 years ago, we didn't have all the diagnostic tools nor the experience to see these types of problems sooner. MRIs and CT scans were nowhere near as good as they are today, and nowadays that's really the gold standard for how we're going to evaluate for AVN, especially early on. Bo Jackson also lived in a different time in terms of what we had at our disposal for rehab and treatments. There were also reports that Bo Jackson had significant loss of cartilage in his hip joint as a result of this injury, and this is something to keep in mind for Tua as well, because this is definitely a risk after these dislocations. So yeah, for an injury that's pretty rare, they are similar things that we can draw some comparisons to, but I think it's probably a little bit too premature to say that, well, this happened to Bo Jackson, it ended his career, this is also going to end Tua's career. This is definitely an injury for Tua that could be career-ending. These dislocations, like I said, increase your risk of having arthritis in the hip. Based on how severe the possible fracture is, he's going to have a very, very prolonged recovery period, and it's going to take a long time just to get back into football shape. And so in these instances, I'd be thinking more about just this person's quality of life. We want to hopefully avoid having to do a hip replacement. We want him to be able to at least do some activities in the future like running, walking, jogging. And yeah, football is going to be at the top of his priorities to get back to, but when something this severe happens, we really need to take a step back and I think first focus on just this person's quality of life. We probably won't know how this is going to affect the rest of Tua's career for months and potentially a year or so from now, just based on how long these take to recover, even if somebody is going to get back to their playing abilities. My thoughts go out to Tua here. I wish him the best in his recovery. I hope this video helped teach you guys a little bit here about what's going on and hopefully kind of sift through some of the news you might be seeing online about these comparisons with Bo Jackson, about this risk of avascular necrosis, and just bring this all together and hopefully learn something from this really unfortunate situation. Thanks though as always for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.